All right. Here today with the, would you say host and co-host or just co-hosts?
Just co-hosts. Sure.
Co-host of the science fiction, classic science fiction short story podcast To Be Determined, and also just two regular people.
I met irregular people. You never know.
Well, the problem is most people are irregular, so the regular ones stand out these days. So
That's
Dan,
true. Normal is overrated.
Yeah, Dan, I met you at a writers group in Neptune Beach, Florida, and found out you had this podcast, the To Be Determined one. Mm-hmm. And we were talking a little about that. And I have this podcast that talks about content creation and creativity in general. Bill, this is the first time we've talked, but I feel like I know you more because I've listened to a couple of y'all's episodes on Spotify, which is a platform that I think that's my go-to platform for listening to podcasts and seeing them. But I appreciate y'all being here today to talk about creativity and content creation and whatever else comes up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for having us today. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Bill, I understand you're not in Florida.
No, I'm up in Michigan. It is raining, cold, and snowy actually here today.
Huh. I just had to turn the air conditioner up.
So if you look behind Ross, you see it's sunny and like 78 degrees here.
Yeah, out here on the Deerwood Links, people are playing golf. There's a little pickleball in the background. Yeah, it's great stuff going on here.
Terrible place to live.
I have my space heater on in that direction over there.
Oh. Wow.
Don't you have your dogs come in and don't they use you as their space heater?
Oh, I deliberately left them in the house when I came out because otherwise, especially the pup would be trying to climb into my lap and join the podcast.
Oh. Bill was smart enough to Bill was smart enough to build an entire studio in his garage so he could get away.
Yeah.
Nice. How long have y'all been doing that, doing your podcast?
This is a couple of years.
Yeah, at least 2 years, I would say.
Yeah. We've had a couple of hiatus periods, first because of getting busy and most recently because of resolving some technical issues. But otherwise, overall though, we've been active for 2 years. We've got 25 episodes, 26 episodes released, and we've got 5 in the hopper ready to go or on the way to getting ready to go.
Oh, okay. How often do y'all record when you're not on the pauses?
Well, it depends. We've sometimes knocked a few out in a week, and of course, doing the podcast is not necessarily the difficult part. It's all of the editing and everything else that comes after, which fortunately Bill does and I don't. So I kind of leave it up to him. But the schedule for releases are, I guess I would call it fairly random.
Yeah, when we're consistent, we're every couple of weeks to like every 3 weeks, and then there's just periods of time where we're less consistent, and we're actually in a less consistent period of time. But I'm about to fix that.
So as far as starting, I guess, to have a linear path, what are y'all's setups for the podcast? Like, where do you record them? When you started, were you in the same place or always distance?
No, we've pretty much always been, Bill's lived in Michigan, not your whole life, right? But I've been in Florida for 20 years. So basically, we've been collaborating remotely for almost the entire time. Once in a while, Bill will come down and hang out down here in Florida for a few weeks, and we can knock out a couple episodes when he's staying down here. But by and large, it's usually we're doing it remotely.
Yeah. We tend to record like in the evening through Zoom, and like Dan was making reference to, like I'll gather the files on this end, do the post production, and then the release. And we use Transistor FM as our podcasting platform for releasing and distributing episodes.
Okay, so that means you get the RSS feed through them, and then they do it all. Okay. Yeah, I'm limited now to Spotify and YouTube just because I was starting out and I was like, let's try a small target and go from there. So at the beginning of next year, I'm looking at maybe expanding out to some other platforms. We worry about getting kicked off of some platforms for saying or covering the wrong thing, but that
Right.
hasn't happened so far yet.
Well, one nice thing about Transistor is that it's built in a whole bunch of pathways to connect with a number of services, including, like you mentioned, referencing us on Spotify. So we're on at least a dozen different platforms for distribution, but it's really easy to manage that through Transistor. And one of the reasons that I went with Transistor initially is that although I do the podcast with Dan, actually I record a podcast for my department because I'm a university professor at Saginaw Valley State University. And in fact, I just recorded an episode of that yesterday with an alumnus, and I'm about to launch a new podcast by probably January 1st or so with two colleagues from other universities that are focused on technical communication and information design. And then I'm teaching podcasting. And so I release stuff connected to my podcasting class through those platforms as well. That way students can get access to some of that stuff.
And I'm just a slacker.
Okay, nice.
So,
That was a good single shot movie back in the day, I think. Allegedly single shot. Yeah. So when you decided to do a podcast, how did you decide what topic you were going to do and like the format?
well, that kind of developed over a number of sessions, usually including some adult beverages, right? I mean, I've been a science fiction aficionado for many, many years, and I think Bill has been, kind of on and off into that genre as well. And we were I think it was back probably when you were starting to teach podcasting, Bill, or you were, thinking about having it as part of the department. And we were kind of joking around like, hey, what if we tried to do a podcast on some of the topics we were both interested in? And, classic science fiction came up, and, it's not exactly what we would say is a new topic. Clearly, lots of other people have done at least blogs. When blogs were big, lots of people did science fiction blogs about classic sci-fi. But podcasting doesn't seem to be an area where a lot of people cover those topics, at least that we've been able to find. There's a few, but when you look at what we focused in on, it seems that not a lot of people either want to or haven't thought about looking at the classic science fiction area as a valid thing to do.
They tend to be more focused on contemporary fiction or on sci-fi films, sci-fi television. There's a podcast I stumbled across, not going to recall the title offhand, but they do an episode on every episode of the classic Star Trek series. So like that's their podcast, is episode by episode. They work their way through the series.
Well, they're going to run out quick. Wasn't that only 3 years? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Maybe they'll move on to there's plenty of series in that franchise now that they could be focused on. So
true.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, what we kind of try to do with the classic sci-fi stuff is, it's been around for, in some cases, 60, 70 years, right? It kind of spans from the 40s through the 70s. And, we'll go a little bit farther forward or farther back, depending on the author and the subject. But that's, primarily the sweet spot. But the real question is how do these stories stand up over time, right? What are the ideas that they're trying to cover, and how relevant are they to, the society we have today?
Yeah, I noticed on one of the ones I've listened to, and I'm glad I found it because I will definitely continue listening to it. I threw up a 5-star rating on Spotify, by the way. First one was Starship Troopers. Why are you hating on Starship Troopers? I mean, it's a classic. It's a classic. I know you're not going to cover it because it's full length, but
yeah, it's funny. That's one of those stories that it's not maligned so much because of the original novel, but because of the way that it's been represented in cinema. That first movie that came out somewhere in the 80s, it's just been blasted by so many people in that are sci-fi, especially film aficionados.
And the second and the third. I think there's 3 or there are 4. I don't even know how many films they're up to now.
There's an animated one that's out now. They might be more like 6.
Oh my God.
Hilarious.
I haven't seen all of them, but I like the book and I like the first one. Goodness.
It's actually been years since I've read the book.
Yeah, I don't even know if I have a copy of it still in my collection. I have to go upstairs and look.
Heinlein is one of
I think I
those
have.
authors that would have been like one of the first people that I read a lot of stuff from, and so yeah, I absolutely love Heinlein. And the story that we did is Dan picked it in part because there's so much that's been talked about with the novels. And this was such an obscure story that we figured, nobody's going to have read this one, or very few people are going to have read this one anyway. So we'll maybe introduce something new to people.
Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the points of the show is to not only cover what I guess would be talk about is the mainstream sci-fi authors. We do cover Clark and Heinlein and Bradbury, right? All the big names, but we also try to bring some of the more obscure authors that people have never heard of that we're like, who is this person? And if you do some research, they may have been writers for TV shows. Some of the people that we've covered were writers for maybe the original Star Trek series. Some of them did like Twilight Zone episodes, but they're relatively unknown people. And it's kind of good to get, kind of resurrect these people and kind of maybe reintroduce them to people who have probably never heard of them.
Well, and there's some of the people that like the mainstream public may have no concept that these people exist, but writers, the people that individual writers will celebrate as, hey, this person was incredibly influential. So for example, we did a story by R.A. Lafferty, and Neil Gaiman is one of the people who he's referred to Lafferty as one of maybe the best writer of all time. And that's pretty high praise from a pretty successful author. And so, we use those kind of references from time to time where we stumble across an author that says, yeah, I was really influenced by this person. We'll go read that person and then pick a story from them and bring them in.
And I think J.G. Ballard was one of the other ones that when we ran across him, he was more of a new age science fiction guy. But yeah, he had high praise from all sorts of other people. And you're like, really? I never would have thought of Ballard as a huge influence in the field, but clearly he was.
Right.
Wow.
So we're learning.
It's kind of like,
it's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's like finding out that You Got What I Need, that song wasn't an original, and then you go back and hear the original, and you're like, oh, it's good. It's just not quite what I need.
Mm-hmm. It's not what I want.
Yeah. So when you get together, you decide to do this show. What kind of equipment did you start with? Is it the same type of stuff you have now, or was it more of?
I think Bill can
you
probably
just
talk
started
about
with
the
what you
rig we've
had?
been using. It's the roadcaster platform, right?
So when the pandemic hit and higher education, all education did the pivot and we went into online learning, that semester, my university was wise enough to allow us, those of us who had any money in our professional development accounts, to spend it on equipment that we would use for teaching in online spaces. And so we had just purchased for a studio on campus a Rodecaster Pro, which is a mobile podcasting station. And then because that was the unit that we went with, this particular microphone is a Rode Pod mic and it's optimized for that system. So I had a couple of those. Dan originally started with one of my
one of your older mics. So
so he had a
been
Rode,
upgraded a few times.
He had a Focusrite 2i2 and
the Cloud Lifter
58. Yeah. And so now he's got the same thing. So I brought him a Rode Pod mic like the one that I've got here. So that's what he's got set up. You would wind up upgrading to a new 2i2 that's got better internal equipment.
Right, because I think the old one blew up.
That's right. Yeah, I was able to
somehow
resurrect it, but yeah. So the stuff that we've got, and you may be able to see behind me, those are acoustic panels back there. I built an audio studio during the pandemic to teach out of. And then when I go down there and we record, we've got a space down there that we set up that where we can, be in the same room together and so on. But it's the same equipment because it just travels with me when we're doing that kind of stuff.
How do you find the interaction different when you're in the same room versus online?
The first time that we recorded together in person, it was funny because we were so used to looking at each other in the screen that then we're on the opposite sides of the table, and it was, maneuvering around the mic to see each other, and it actually felt weird and more awkward to do it in person the first time than it was to do it through Zoom.
And actually,
Yeah.
usually when we're recording, I'm not even looking at Bill. He usually has the waveform up in what in Adobe Audition. That's what we use the as the primary recording mechanism and editing. And so I'm usually watching the waveform as I'm talking, and I'm not paying any attention to what Bill's doing in the actual little window. So having him there and not being able to see the waveform was completely different. I was almost lost.
Yeah. And when we first started off, like a lot of people who are engaged in those kind of projects online or even in person, we talked over each other all the time. And so one of the nice things about Audition is that I was able to create separation and remove the overlap so that we sounded more polite to one another, so we sounded more articulate. But then over time, making those
Editing makes you sound smart.
at least that's one of the goals.
Or we hope.
But
Yeah, I was wondering how much editing you have to do.
Well, it depends on the episode. There are some, if we haven't recorded in a while, it'll take a bit more editing. Once we're in a groove, when we're in the habit of recording every week or two, it's really a process that just kind of runs itself, because we're really good now when we're in that moment of recognizing, okay, I'm coming to the end of a thought and Dan's already picked up on that, and I can see he's ready to say something. And so, we give each other those spaces. So now, instead of separating overlapping audio, it's more trimming down the gaps in between so that it sounds more like a continuous and dynamic conversation.
And if you look at some of the or listen to some of the first episodes, we went through a learning process of what do we really need to effectively be able to podcast, right? We started with basically no plan. It's just us talking, and quickly after a few episodes realized we needed some kind of structure to stick to. So we came up with this idea that we're going to kind of step through each of the episodes with the same format. We're going to start with this, and we're going to move into this phase and this phase and this phase. Because one of the things that, quite honestly, I found is we'd finish recording an episode and I'd be like, damn, I was going to talk about this subject and I forgot. So now that we've got a reference, a little story, kind of next to me on the screen, I can see, okay, these are all the topics I had planned on covering. And as we go through, I can kind of mentally check them off and go, okay, yep, got that topic in, ignore that topic because I decided it wasn't relevant, things like that. Right. So we have these internal show notes that we use while we're actually doing the podcast to remind us of, number one, what the story is and all of the various pieces we want to cover, as well as all of the connections outside the story that we'd like to explore.
Right.
Okay. How did you decide on doing a non-video podcast, or do you do a video podcast and I just see it on Spotify as just audio?
We had talked about it. One of the things that we run into every once in a while is just bandwidth issues. You were making reference to that earlier, where there are maybe 2 or 3 episodes where we've had clunky audio, where I try to think, I think Johnny Mnemonic was one of the ones where Dan's audio was kind of distorted, and I did a lot of the post-production work trying to tweak it and got it to the level that it's at. But when we were experiencing those kinds of things with just audio, we knew that there'd be potentially some issues with doing video on top of it. And so we've talked about adding video in at some point. We may still do that in the future, but for just having good quality production values, we stuck with audio to begin with.
Yeah, and I'm not really sure what it adds to the content, being able to see my talking head, and no one's going to accuse me of being the most handsome person in the world. So, I'm not sure what that really adds to the content by being able to see us talk. So, but everybody has their own opinion, right?
I can always
like that it gives you the option.
Just bring them in.
Yeah, I like
Maybe
the
I'll just have
option
an avatar.
You can do those, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's just a letter and it's flashing when you talk.
So you were just saying that you like having that option?
Yeah, when I probably got into podcasts with, it's probably Joe Rogan some years ago, maybe 2018 or a little before. We were living in an RV, me and my wife and two pugs, and we're driving around the country. Great way to see the country.
Yeah.
And it's like being in a time machine, because she could go to sleep and then I could drive for 300 to 600 miles. And you can drive a lot easier when you know you have a huge fuel tank and you have a bathroom right there if you need it. So you
Right.
can push it right to the limit. You don't have to worry about, am I going to make it? It's right there. So usually it was stopping because the dogs had to go out. But if they're sleeping, we're in good shape. But listening to a lot of different things, music, you can only listen to your playlist. I mean, even though you have however many thousands of songs on your phone, eventually you want something else. And started listening to a lot of talk radio and then like satellite radio. And I didn't know about podcasts so much back then, but I enjoyed listening to it. And then also you could look at it if they would say, well, look at this clip right here, or just putting a face with the sound, a little different than radio. And now I'm probably the ones I listen to the most. I'm going to add y'all's podcast to the mix. And then like still some Joe Rogan stuff, a lot of Adam Carolla, that's just audio as well, but he puts out a lot of episodes. And like Tim Dillon, which is, you have the audio option. You can watch it on YouTube, I think, if he hadn't gotten kicked off of it. And Spotify, it's just audio. And that's what got me into the podcasting, was just thinking, if you're going to talk to people about things, which is a purpose of the writing group, is to meet strange people. So let's talk to strange people too, if you can, but you have to have some sort of topic. So
Right.
I think that's what got me into podcasting. How about y'all?
Two of the podcasts that I listen to have simulcasts with video. So Star Talk, that's Neil deGrasse Tyson, and then one of his guests, a regular guest, is Chuck Liu, who's a professor from the University of Staten Island, and he's when he goes on Star Talk, he's the geek in chief. So he's the guy that they bring in when they do Q&A with fans that are really far ranging in topics, because he's one of those like generally knowledgeable dudes. And he's also really into sci-fi. So then he has his own podcast, that's the Looniverse. And again, both of those have simulcast with video. And so like I said, I teach podcasting. I've got some students who are interested in exploring what it means to do both of those together. For some of it now, in fact, I was just talking about this with another co-creator, that it's the editing process. If we do a lot of editing on a particular episode, I worry sometimes about how that would get disrupted, or how that would disrupt the video component of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how much does that add? I've done a little bit of that stuff, but all the really simple, minimalistically edited kinds of things. So if we're doing much content editing, I worry sometimes about how that translates into the video component.
Yeah, and we've talked also a little bit about, some people, when I talk about the podcast, they say, well, who are your guests? Right. And we go, well, we don't really have guests. We talk about the subject matter, the story, the author, and everything else, but we never really have brought guests onto the show. And we've kind of gone back and forth. And Bill, I think you've commented before, there's, of course, many, many, many different types of podcasts. Some are interview based, right? Some are not. Ours tends to not be, but we've often talked about, well, what other things could you do to increase that interest level? Should we think about bringing on guests? Kind of like you're doing, Ross. Talking to interesting people.
Assuming,
yeah, I do like y'all's podcast. The first thing that struck me was the graphic. I like the graphic. I think we talked about it before we started recording, that how you made it, but that, and then your dynamic together is good. And I guess that, like, I've listened to some early shows, I've listened to the more recent ones as well. And I guess that's now peek behind the curtain. It's a little bit of the editing where you separate the voices out, but it's one of the main things I've found doing online is you don't talk over the person as much because you can't hear what they're saying when you are talking, but it teaches you to listen better. And if you're in person, I haven't done one in person yet, so I worry about that, just as far as equipment and cameras and getting the right angles. But y'all's podcast also, it had I don't mean this in an Eddie Haskell kind of way, like an NPR feel to it. Like I was calm when I was listening to it. And I think the guests for y'all's is obviously the story. So that's how I would answer that question if anybody asked me who the guest was.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
It's a good way of putting it. Absolutely.
Our guests are all deceased.
Most of them.
They're the most cooperative. You don't have to worry about if they're going to show up or not. That's one of the things that with doing, like I use Matchmaker FM for some podcast guests. A lot of them are people I knew or met or people I know. And there's some that are strangers. And I do worry, like, are they ever going to show up? And what am I going to do if I have a week where I don't have an episode? And should I try to like bank an episode in case somebody doesn't show up, but then you're recording something from someone and it can go on for weeks that they're not getting put on. I try to do when I record it within a week or two of recording it is when it gets published, just to manage expectations. And you don't want people just waiting all the time and then forgetting about it. But how do y'all go ahead?
I was going to say that's, we kind of talked a little bit about that with our sort of sporadic recording, schedule. I think at one point in time, Bill, you had put out something that we're going to try to do it every 2 or 3 weeks to drop a new episode. And well, that worked until life gets busy, right? I mean, this is something that we do it's not a side hustle, right? We don't have sponsors. We don't have, money coming in. It's just something we do because we enjoy it. So when you're trying to do it with your day job and everything else that goes on in life, just sometimes, things happen.
Well, and like I said, this most recent hiatus, one of the things I'm the reason that the technology failed us, because I recorded an episode where I trusted in the settings because we had literally just recorded. And so I left the settings, jumped on mic, we start recording. I go back to edit it and I realize Dan's audio is clipping, and I started tracing the problem. And what I hadn't paid attention to was that Adobe Audition upgraded, and when it upgraded, it created an interface problem with the Rodecaster Pro that was a known issue, but I hadn't realized that it was a known issue. And so then it like stopped me in my tracks. So like, okay, do we go back and re-record the episode, or is there a way that I could try to fix this? And I began trying to work on the fix, and I've resolved it with, some success. And now I'll release that episode and we'll get back into that process again of re-releasing on a regular basis. But that technology disruption it was a lesson, but it was also one of those things where I didn't want to put out something that had clearly inferior audio quality, because we would have been better off just to skip the episode and go back and re-record the ending of the most recent one to say, hey, we're going to go on to the next story instead. But so, that's one of those things where hopefully now that we've resolved those issues, we'll be able to get back into that regular kind of cadence with it. I find myself, I miss it. If we aren't getting the chance to jump on mic, one of the reasons that we started it was an excuse for us to get together on a regular basis from 700 miles away or whatever it is, and be like, hey, Dan, let's go record. Hey, Bill, yeah, let's get you, let's go read a story together. Let's get rolling. So like, I miss that regular interaction.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that they talk about with podcasting is however often you do it, you need to have some sort of pattern because you lose your listeners otherwise. And I've experienced that recently with just with Joe Rogan, actually. Like, he was gone or didn't publish anything for a week or two, and I started filling that in with other things, and now it's hard to get back into that. But two ideas here. How much of podcasting is similar to sailing, where you always have to be doing something like move this thing, move that thing. And it seems like you can really dive into the technical side of podcasting and start worrying about being able to switch from cameras or mics, or what are you going to do through different programs and how they sync together. How many, you teach a podcasting class, so you probably have some insight on this. How many people do you think that keeps out of starting a podcast just because the fear of the technical side?
Oh, it's huge, actually. Yeah. And so one of the things that we do at the university is we secured through grant money enough money to build a studio that's a permanent studio. And then in addition to that, we have right now 4 mobile kits. And so students, depending on how they are doing their production work, they'll either check out the studio and work in there, or they'll check out one of the mobile kits so they can record with people over the weekend or through Zoom and stuff like that. It just makes it easier for them. But the whole point of us getting all of that equipment and making it available was so that they didn't have to use their onboard microphone with their computer or what's on their cell phone. Although that technology is much better than it used to be, it's, we wanted them to have as low stakes a pathway as we could provide into the technical side, and then of course the creator side. And what are you going to do with that, and how are you going to prepare, and how are you going to record in terms of just the meeting and the speaking logistics, and it's a process. So like right now the class is at a point where they are editing their 3rd episodes of their podcast series that they're producing this semester right now, and I'll get to hear those this weekend. And then they'll have one more episode because we're nearing the end of the semester. And then the very last thing they'll do is they'll record a 60-second teaser, that's basically a commercial for their podcast. But by the time they get to there, like I always tell them that the goal is by the time you get to episode 4, you're feeling comfortable, you're feeling confident, you're feeling like, hey, this is everything coming together and it works now. And there's some people who are already there 2 episodes in. There's some who are still struggling with the confidence in either themselves or the technology going, into this 3rd episode. So yeah, it's definitely, there's a whole bunch of different learning arcs that people are on with that stuff, but almost everyone is intimidated by the prospect at the front of the class. And by the time they get done, when they're feeling good about life, I'm thinking that was a successful semester.
Okay. There's a lot of videos, YouTube especially, about podcasting and the type of equipment you can have and what's the best equipment and how to run a podcast. You can get lost, and I imagine it's kind of the same as writing, because you sit down to write and then you go, well, let me just look at a video about, where do other writers write? Let's see their writing studio and what's their pattern. And next thing, 5 hours go by, you haven't looked at any porn and you've looked at all of YouTube and you haven't written anything. So
it's real easy to get sucked down that rabbit hole of, I'm going to find out everything there is to know about a topic, but then never actually do anything with it.
Right.
Yeah.
I curate videos for them. My favorite that students love is a dude from the UK named Mike Russell. His YouTube channel is radiomusiccreative.com, and his stuff, well, one, he's got a great voice, and he's done a lot of audio production, and he does a lot of videos telling people about technologies, telling people about logistics and editing and the whole bit. So he's easy to follow. He understands that that people are probably learning from him. He's really conscious of that learning curve, and he's so consistent in the way that he produces his content that, like I said, he's the guy. He's my go-to for my students, and every one of them winds up saying afterward, "Yep, it was a really great set of resources that you put in front of us."
Yeah, I think I've looked at a bunch of his stuff. And then StreamYard, which is the platform I use now, has so much built in like audio and video stuff that helps you, that I don't use the audio video like GarageBand or anything else to separate all that afterwards. So there's all different types of podcasting you can do. I mean, I guess it's more of like the way it sounds like you're doing it, more high end, more professional. And then I think anybody can just get into it. It's the keeping going that's going to be the issue, because
And
oftentimes you do find yourself going, why am I doing this? But
didn't
if you're
Bill,
doing
you
it
say
just
that
to talk, go ahead.
Adobe has just come out with their new podcasting app, right? Adobe Podcast, which again, if you've used the Adobe products for other things, they're pretty good at user interfaces and pretty good at well featured and well designed programs. So it's just becoming more and more accessible to everybody. I think in one episode we were joking about, I have a podcast just like everybody else has a podcast nowadays, right?
Well, the nice
But
thing
I
about
wonder,
audio equipment is that it's come down so far in price. I mean, for like when my students are asking those questions, I have a series of written answers that I could put out to them. Okay, you got $100 to spend. Here you go. You got 200. You got 250. I've got probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,000, including the studio itself, invested in the process now. But that wasn't all at once. It's like little by little by little, over a long period of time. And then in the classes, like you said, yeah, we're not trying to teach them to be audio engineers. We're trying to teach them to be competent and comfortable with audio production, so that could be dropped into a podcast, a social media stream, an instructional video. Because the work that my students do when they graduate is all over the map, from web design to document design to book editing and publishing. And a lot of those positions that they're going into now are somehow connected to social media. And when they can do something with audio production that's beyond what your cell phone's capable of, employers love that. Just the comfort, like I said, and the confidence to be able to do something that sounds professional, and that's but without, like I said, without being an audio engineer.
what are your top 2 or 3 things that when you're looking at somebody's, I guess, a student work or a podcast in general, that you kind of either consciously or subconsciously can say, this is good, or this is something you like?
Yeah, I actually tell them every semester. I get to a point, and it's actually right around now, where most of the students are dealing with or have settled their technical foibles, and they're just into it. And as soon as they relax on mic, whether it's them alone or their regular guest, because a lot of them record with somebody else, it actually gets to a point where I forget I'm grading, and I just get sucked into the podcast. I'm listening to them. And one of the best things for me is that I've got students who won't really talk much in class, and as soon as they get on mic, it's like boom, there's this explosion of energy and creativity and sometimes intellect, it feels like. And I just get so excited to be listening to it, because they've turned that corner and now they're really engaged in the process, and they're just talking, or they're just teaching, or whatever it is that they're trying to get across with their podcast. Those are fantastic moments. Like when I lose myself in it and I forget that I'm grading, I feel like I did my job.
How about when you do a podcast, how do you, after you finish one, are there things that you go, ooh, that was good? Or like, what are the highlights that stick out to you the most?
In our podcast?
Yeah.
Well,
Like when you're done with it. Yeah.
It's usually when we go off on some random tangent that we never expected, that takes us in a direction that we had never intended to go, which, listeners may or may not appreciate that. But, we will end up in like some humorous debate about, something that, somebody said or was going to say, or that the author was trying to make. And, I like to bring as much humor into the podcast as possible, whether it's, dark humor or not. But yeah, I think the best episodes we've had were the ones where, you can tell, right? When you're listening, you've listened to a few of them. There's ones where you're like, okay, you're going through the content, but there's others where you've got that real dynamic going, the back and forth.
Right.
And those tend to be the best ones.
They're definitely the most fun.
Yeah. I found when you forget that you're not looking at the clock anymore and you're like, oh, that time went by. Yeah.
Yeah, there's been a few episodes where we get like 35, 40 minutes in, and the stuff that you don't get to hear because I cut it out is, well, Dan, where do we go next? I don't know.
Let's just
How
let's
are
just
we going to wrap
trash
this
Starship
up? Yeah.
Troopers. Yeah.
How are we going to end this?
So one of the reasons that we came up with the scale that we put it on, the woe,
Mhm.
is in part because we wanted something late in the show that we could use as okay, back to reality. Here's our anchor point. We're almost ready to wrap up the episode, and that'll become a pattern. And it's actually served that way really well. Where if we're starting to flounder or we're not sure where we want to go, then one of us would be like, well, how about we talk about where it falls on the scale,
Yeah.
the pending scale.
Yeah. All right then. So that's the setup and your technical side and equipment. How do you determine what books you're going to or what stories you're going to look at?
That's a lot of noodling around in dusty bookstores in the anthology section. So, I mean, I at home have a fairly extensive collection, which is kind of how it started. It was just kind of going through what I had and what Bill had locally and going, oh, these would be interesting stories. And those were the first ones came from. But, I'm sure, Ross, you're familiar down here with Chamblin Book Mine, right?
Mhm.
With, thousands upon thousands of books. And so a lot of times we'll go down there and just kind of start pawing through the anthologies and going, this one's looks interesting. It's been curated by a pretty good author. It's probably got some good stuff in it, but it's just a lot of reading. And, the good news is there's a lot of content out there. The bad news is a lot of it is really not very good. So
Right.
you have to read quite a number of stories before you find ones that you're really engaged in. Right. And unfortunately now a lot of this stuff is out on the internet and the Internet Archive. You can read, tons of old, fantasy and science fiction magazines from back in the day. So, because sometimes I'll find a book, Bill won't have it, but we can find the content online somewhere so we can still collaborate. But yeah, I mean, I find that the most interesting stories we do are the ones that have multiple, I guess, story arcs going on inside it. Because anybody can write a story about, okay, a boy goes into his garage, builds a rocket ship, goes to the moon, it meets an alien. There's a million of those stories out there. But when the ones that are interesting, I find are ones that can bridge, economics and literature and philosophy and history, and they'll just take little snippets of all these different genres and kind of put them together in a coherent and readable story.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so like the next episode that'll come out is on James Tiptree Jr. and the last episode that we recorded was Alex. It was an obscure one, but one that we stumbled.
10:01 a.m. 10:01 a.m.
Yeah. So, sometimes we'll have an author and we'll think, yeah, we gotta find it, like Bradbury. We read so many Bradbury stories looking for the one that we were going to record. And so one of the reasons that we didn't record him right away is that we just kept reading and reading and reading Bradbury stories. And then finally we settled on one like a year and a half in and recorded it or something like that. So,
That's one of the ones
starting
I
off
listened
with
to.
Arthur C. Clarke was just like, hey, here's a name that everybody associates with sci-fi. Let's pick one of his to begin with because it'll help put us on the map as far as what we're trying to do.
Okay. I think we talked about a little bit about your publishing, that you go through that one place. Did you try anything else before that?
I actually had
Don't
stumbled
remember.
across that one because before doing this podcast, I was releasing a different podcast connected to my departmental workings. And when I was getting ready to launch that one, my co-host for that, he and I reviewed easily a dozen different platforms. We looked at some of the free ones, and then we settled in. We realized that we had some resources, so we wanted to get a paid platform, and we started looking for the ones that had the best combination of tools, of feeds, and so on. And we picked Transistor because a lot of them make you pay by each podcast you host. And what Transistor does instead is it says you can host as many podcasts as you want to create. What we'll do is we'll charge you according to how many downloads you get. So we bought the basic platform. And if we grow to a point where the cumulative podcasts that are released through it, get to a point where they're getting enough hits, which would be, nice problem to have, we'll expand the capabilities from there. But we've got a good durable baseline that'll last us until something really takes off, if anything ever does.
Does that mean that if they're going by your amount of downloads, that you pay your normal subscription fee monthly or yearly, and then they take a portion of, well, I guess people aren't buying for the downloads, so
Right.
you just have a bank setup of the amount?
Yeah, as long as we don't go over a certain number of downloads a month, we're just within our account parameters. And if we ever get to the point where we get close, they were really honest about it in their promotional materials. They said, if you get to the point where you're at the next plateau, we won't stop you from releasing episodes. We won't keep people from downloading them, but we'll come talk to you and say, hey, it's time for you to upgrade. So
they can't do something where they get paid through sponsorship or commercials or anything like that?
They
just
actually have
gotta
stuff
pass
on
it
their
along to you?
site. They will help you do that. And they basically said, once you've covered your fees, we're out of it. Anything, if we monetize, any profit that we get goes right to us, and then we get to do with it what we will. So they don't want to lay any claim to any money that we would ever make. They just want to make their money off of the hosting itself.
Oh, okay, I see. And did you use that one starting out, or did you have another way you did it?
Actually, we were using a streaming app where people could just go directly to the file, and we would publish locations, and that was a temporary fix. We always knew it was a temporary fix. By the time that we were getting into production, we settled on Transistor. So it's pretty much what I've always used. But I in the process of teaching it, of course, in fact, in the next class period, I'll be talking about this stuff. How do you host? Where do you host? How do you make those decisions? And so all of my students this time, like always, will start off with free hosting, those that even want to host at this point, because it's not required. And then I've had a couple of students go on and develop some successful stuff. And I think they're all going through free services.
Do you market anything, or do you do clips on other like social media platforms?
We've talked about doing that kind of stuff. We're at a
Yeah,
point
you have like
where,
a whole T-shirt design written up at some point in time.
so we talked about things like,
Some merch.
at what
That's
point
right.
you want to do t-shirts or Patreon and so on. And when we were first starting off, we weren't really settled into a format yet, like Dan was talking about earlier. So we thought, well, let's get some episodes out there. Now that we've got enough episodes out there, we could absolutely, focus on monetizing, whether that means getting commercials onto other podcasts, or paying for things like Google ads or Facebook ads or Spotify ads or whatever the case may be. And that's certainly a consideration that we could enter into now at this point.
Just all takes more time.
Yep.
That might be one of those things that an audio podcast or a video podcast makes easier, is because you can do clips on Instagram and YouTube and
That's a good point.
X and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've actually talked about or thought about doing something like doing a Zoom recording when we're on, so that I could take some of those clips and throw them into TikToks or Reels or something like that.
Yeah.
Like with highlights.
StreamYard has a good, it sounds like I'm doing a commercial for StreamYard. I don't get paid from StreamYard. I just pay them, but they have a good way that you can clip stuff out. I've looked at a few other ones through just going through those, the YouTube videos on try this one, try this one, try this one. And I think you just find one that has the stuff you want and then learn that and see how you feel about it. But right now I do clips on Instagram and X, and it's the same clip, so I don't have to do different ones for each. But that takes up a lot of time. I can only imagine if I did the audio like you do with all the editing and things, then every episode would take hours to do, because it takes probably an hour or so to clip it out. and that's using some pretty friendly software. And then you have to put it on those other platforms. You could pay for those other services that you could schedule it, but I don't do that yet. So
yeah, but you're right. That's one of the considerations then is when you start thinking beyond, okay, are we recording for ourselves, for our own, like, enjoyment in the moment? Are we trying to do something that we want to get out there and see if we can generate an audience? We've always had the notion that we would generate an audience, and we've got a handful of regulars that are with us, but nowhere near what we would call successful if that's our measure for success. So like I said, now we're at a point where we've got enough episodes out there that if somebody were to jump on and start listening, they could listen for a while without having to worry about what's coming next. And,
mhm.
and that's that point where you can start thinking, okay, what are the easiest processes for advertising that you can practice and what makes sense for us to do and what really fits our format, or where are people looking. Like we joined some, at least I joined some Facebook groups that are sci-fi related. Dan has banned himself from Facebook for a long time and I'm sure that
I'm a non-social media person.
Nice.
So,
but I haven't actually gone and promoted the podcast on any of those places yet, in part because I wanted to make sure that we were ready to do that before I started putting out there, hey, if anybody's interested, we've got this podcast.
Yeah, I can see that. Maybe the difference is if you're dealing with subject matter that is there, like you're doing short stories and you have somebody that you're doing the podcast with that is going to show up, that you don't have to worry so much about getting you don't have to worry about marketing so much, not for the sense of making money, but just getting the word of the show out.
Right.
But if you have guests, they have to have some reason they're coming on there. Like I've sent out a lot of invitations and got back a lot less. So you get a lot of people that say, well, let me know when you have the 100th episode or the 200th episode. And you're like, okay, I'm going to definitely make a note to not let you know when I have that. So, but
right.
I can see why they don't want to waste their time, because you look at the statistics of podcasts of how many keep going and how many make it or are successful. I think maybe the successful thing is, are you having fun doing it? And are you still doing it? And then you have that other realm of, is it making money? And just like with writing, I don't see that as I'm going to retire as making money off writing or podcasting anytime soon. So I'm just doing it for the fun. I've made tens of dollars writing though. So, I mean, that could be successful.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. You talk a little bit about, the number of podcasts that don't make it. It's kind of unfortunate we picked TBD as the title of the show, because amazingly enough, a lot of people, when they're starting to do a podcast and don't know what they want to do, guess what their title is? TBD.
There are a lot of those out there.
Well, and I realized too late that during the first 3 months of the pandemic, there were something like 20 or 25 podcasts that launched called TBD, and cumulatively all of them produced somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 episodes. So like, in other words,
Wow.
1, 2, or 3 episodes each before they just collapsed.
Oh, okay.
It was funny because then there's this huge gap where there are no new shows called TBD or to be determined, and then there's us. And when we first did it, I actually did a search for names, and the way that I did the search, it didn't come up with all the ones that had been done in the past that were then defunct. And there was only one other podcast called To Be Determined, and it was about like baking or something like that, or like managing your household. And I thought, well, this is not competition for us, so I think we're good. Oh well.
Well, you have a good graphic for it, and that makes it easy to find, especially if you're like looking through. It was easy to find on Spotify. I looked on YouTube and I couldn't find anything with it on there. I looked up your names. I looked up the name of that. And
Yeah, but so Spotify, Apple, and there's one more platform that we get most of our hits from.
Audible.
Yeah, it is Audible. But we've got there's some episodes that have had like Mimsy Where the Borogoves, for example. I think that's the one that's had the most downloads. And so that one's all over the place in terms of the technologies that people have used to access it. And that's actually one of the episodes where I think we've had listeners from New Zealand and Southeast Asia, and we've got an occasional listener from St. Petersburg. Yeah, so it's interesting to be able to see those kinds of things, and see the distribution. There's some where it's all the United States, and then there's some episodes where it's like the scattering across the planet, and that's pretty cool to see that kind of thing. But we don't have tens of thousands of listeners. We've got one on this continent and one in this country.
But
So
hey, if that one person likes it, that's good enough for me.
Yeah,
it's
a start. Yeah. So then, what? I guess you talked about it already. Your plans to do some more, and you have some that are already recorded that you haven't put out yet. Do you?
Yeah, we've got a list of probably 20 or 30 possible episodes at this point that we just haven't had time to do. And like we said, we've covered a lot of the major authors, but there's a bunch of other ones we haven't covered yet. Like we've done like Robert Silverberg, haven't touched him. We do Stanislaw Lem. I don't think we've done him. Just ton. There's just so much content out there and just so little time.
We've kind of held ourselves to a standard right now where we're only going to pick one story from an author to begin with, and at some point we'll eventually start looping back around. We'll do another Asimov story, we'll do another Arthur C. Clarke story, or Heinlein, for example. And like we said, we sometimes pick stories that other people might have talked about before, but we also like to do the ones where nobody's talked about they from Heinlein. But in contrast, a lot of people have talked about Mimsy Where the Borogoves, or a lot of people have talked about Who Goes There, which is the novella that was the inspiration for the movie The Thing, and then other movies that were with similar titles.
Yeah, so, one of them you were talking about what classifies as classic science fiction. In it, I guess you could also talk about your books as being the guests, and if you have the same writer coming back another time, you just say return guest. But have y'all done or thought about doing like shorter ones, like the ones that walked away from Amalas? I think that's the name of it.
Ursula K. Le Guin. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's actually one of those authors that we will do an episode on. The question is, which story? And then that's one of the obvious choices because it's a lot going on in that story. But she's Bradbury-esque for us in that she's got a lot of amazing content. A lot of people like reading her, and sometimes it's difficult to choose which story to cover because there's so many good ones.
And also sometimes, right, these stories have been covered so many times in so many different formats. You think to yourself, is there anything really new we can bring to this story, right? Some of the ones that we cover have been pretty, like we said, pretty obscure. So no one's really talked about them. So it's kind of easy to generate content off of them. But with the major authors that have been around for so long and have been discussed in so many formats, it's like, what new thing are we going to say about Ursula K. Le Guin that hasn't been said?
But then again, the story by Stephen King that nobody has probably read, or only the really deep fans who have all of the short story collections.
Yeah. Plus, you never know who's listening to it. It could be their first exposure for a lot of people to all these classic science fiction things. Is y'all's show? That's fun.
In fact, there's one of my former students who I hang with now who has said he's always been interested in sci-fi, but he'll listen to an episode from us because he hasn't heard of that story before, hasn't had a chance to read that story before, so it becomes kind of an entry point for him.
And we're just waiting for the day that when one of the authors that's actually still alive actually listens to our podcast and says, "Hey,
That's not what that meant.
That would be amusing.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, there was like a Dean Koontz story, right? Dean Koontz
Oh,
is still around, and we were like, Dean Koontz, we have no clue what this story is about. Can you let us know? we read it, we covered it, and we're still like, I have no idea what this guy was trying to say.
Do y'all have a way for people that listen to it to contact y'all? I didn't look at the show notes on Spotify, but do y'all have contact information in there?
We have an email address and we've got a Facebook presence at the moment. We were on X, and we dropped off of it just because things were so chaotic there for a while. I contemplate jumping back on. Although at the point where I started contemplating jumping back on was when Musk started talking about monetizing it, and so yeah, I don't know what'll happen with that.
I wasn't on there. Well, maybe some years ago, probably 2012, 2013, I sent one tweet, the first tweet I ever did to, who's the guy that wrote some film director, because I wrote a book and I was like, hey, maybe there's a book you can make a movie out of. I never got a return tweet on there, but that was my one and only tweet. And then I recently got in after Elon bought it. So I don't know what it was like before, but you can definitely get into a feed that is a wild side. So you have to be careful what you look at. And I like the choice now where you can say, see less of this, and you can curate it on your own. But that's the one I like the best for putting clips on. Instagram worries me because I feel like I'm going to get kicked off of it or some strikes. And also YouTube, I feel like that too, but I don't know if that's maybe not founded yet. I do find that Spotify is a much easier platform for uploading and dealing with than YouTube is, with just all the channels and having to get verified and
Right.
whatnots. But your contact information is on your Spotify account.
Yeah. So anything that allows you to display, which I think all the major platforms do, they allow you to display show notes and stuff like that. The contact information is on there, and then you can also trace it back to the original, like the core site from any of those episodes, and we've got contact information on there as well.
All right. I'll put that contact information in the show notes for this, and also links to the Spotify one. I like it because when you put those clips up on X, it also attaches a link for, if you put a link in there, it does another picture. So I think your flying saucer picture will be present on X when I do that. I'm going to try to find a way to do it.
Very
If
cool.
not,
Fantastic.
Yeah.
what just I guess to round things out here, what kind of stuff or what mode of operation would you change going forward, or if you started again today, or have you settled into how your scheduling and everything that you do with podcasting?
I don't know if we'd change anything. I mean, obviously we could go back and figure out how to, adjust the quality of the earlier episodes, and, make sure that we were a little more organized from the beginning. That would have probably gone a long way to help some of the earliest podcast attempts.
Yeah. Because we've got some good content in the early episodes. Like one of my favorite episodes is the cold equations, and it's good, but we hadn't like settled into any of what we would think of now
Right.
as a formula, if we have a formula, and some of those earlier episodes like that one, or desertion is another one where we were starting to develop the ideas for some of the set pieces, but they weren't fully formed yet. That's part of the reason why we were kind of slow in releasing things to begin with, because we wanted to get a few of them recorded and figure out if we had a pattern that we wanted to follow. Now I think we've got the basic format established. We talk about every once in a while adding something new in, but the last thing that was new that we added in was the scale, the whoa,
Mm-hmm.
And moving on from there, like I said, at some point we could incorporate video, or even like we said, you just bringing in something like we could have an image that's up on the screen if we wanted to simulcast to something like YouTube that isn't necessarily even us, but that would be, I don't know what that would look like, but it'd be worth exploring potentially.
Even if it's just the name of the book, the guest,
Right.
then I think
Right.
that's something, because it's not just the dark screen. From the aspect of a person that listens to it, and I've listened to the first few and the most recent few that are published, I think they sound good. There wasn't like that's why I listened to some of the first ones. I was like, let's see what this started out like.
What are
like
these
the
two
pilot.
idiots really doing?
What's going on right here? But it was just as good. I had a good time with it. So it's, I think, mission accomplished on your podcast so far.
That's good to hear. Yeah, one of the things I think about is I know that there's a couple of places in episodes where audio levels are off, and now I know more how to fix those things, because the audio compression, for example, is a learning curve when you're first getting into it. So I think about going back and tweaking some of the episodes, but not actually reproducing them or re-releasing them. Just quietly slip in a little bit higher quality or a more consistent quality audio file or something like that, just because then I'll know, that it was done that way.
If you don't like sailing, you should try it, because I think you would like it, because it's the equivalent of, let's just, trim the jib a little. Let's just tighten that up. I think we can go a little bit faster, and nobody else notices anything.
Yeah, That's exactly it. And I like those little things, the parts of it, the process that I notice or that Dan notices, but that, they don't get in the way of other people listening or something like that. That's just part of that. It's part of the craft of it. And when I jump into stuff, I write a lot of different kinds of things because of my job and because of my interests. I've done all kinds of creative works. I brew beer. Anything that I get into like that, there's always that baseline. Okay, let's see if I could do it. Proof of concept. As soon as I've got proof of concept, then I begin to think, okay, how can I evolve? How can I grow?
How can we improve on this? Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's where we're at with this. There's always this continuous sense of how could we tweak it just a little bit to make it a little better.
As long as we're not making it worse, I think we're doing a good job.
Yes, there you go.
It's a good point. Good point. It's been a pleasure talking with y'all. Thank you very much for coming on and talking about it. I think it's nice to have a lot of information about a topic kind of condensed down. I think that's what makes your podcast so great, is because who else are you going to talk to about some of those short stories with? You're not going to talk to anybody about them. So it's nice that you feel like you're in the room having the conversation with y'all about the story. And that's what I'm going for with this podcast too. I think you put in a lot of information about podcasting, and people can get a little insight on it easier than looking at a bunch of videos at once.
Very cool. I appreciate you saying that.
Anything else in closure before we head out?
No, thanks
this was a good time.
Yeah, been a really good time.
All right. I'll talk to you at the end of this thing. All right.
Very good.
Sounds good.